In the final months of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled beneath the weight of its own monstrosity, one of Nazi Germany's most secretive weapons programs disappeared into history. Its name was Die Glocke, the bell, and the man who controlled it wielded power so absolute, so terrifying that even Hitler himself depended on his approval. His name was Heinrich Himmler, and his fingerprints were on every unspeakable horror of the Nazi regime. But the story of Die Glocke is not merely one of weapons and warfare. It is the story of a bureaucrat who became a mass murderer, a true believer who transformed ideology into industrial-scale death, and a final desperate gambit to save a doomed empire. What was the bell? Where did it go? And what does its mystery tell us about the darkness that ordinary men were capable of unleashing? These questions have haunted historians for over 70 years. But to understand Die Glocke, we must first understand the man behind it. A man so devoted to Nazi ideology that he made Auschwitz possible. Heinrich Himmler was not born a monster. He was born a failure. In 1900, in a respectable Bavarian middle-class family, young Heinrich arrived into a world where he had everything except the one thing his father desperately wanted: a son who would embody Prussian manhood. His father was a tutor, a man of discipline and order, who raised his boy with the suffocating expectations of Imperial Germany. Himmler was weak, sickly, myopic. He wore glasses that made him look perpetually startled. He was bullied, unremarkable, destined for obscurity. In photographs from his youth, he looks almost pitiable, a thin-faced young man with haunted eyes, trying desperately to appear impressive. This psychological wound, this desperate hunger to prove himself, would become the seedbed of unimaginable brutality. The Weimar Republic was collapsing when Himmler came of age. Germany was drowning in humiliation, economic chaos, and political violence. Millions of Germans felt betrayed, abandoned, searching for someone, anyone to blame. Into this void stepped Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party, offering not just answers, but a mythology. They promised rebirth. They promised strength. They promised that Germany would rise again. For a man like Himmler, who had spent his entire life feeling weak and inadequate, Nazism was not merely politics. It was salvation. It was a pathway to transformation. It was the language of power. Himmler joined the SS in 1925, not as a warrior, but as member number 168. The SS was then a small paramilitary unit, barely noticed, overshadowed by the much larger SA. But Himmler saw something in the SS that others did not. He saw an instrument of absolute control. More importantly, he saw a structure that rewarded loyalty above all else, where a man of adequate intelligence but supreme dedication could rise to unimaginable heights. He was relentless. He studied, he maneuvered, he cultivated relationships. Within a decade, he had transformed the SS from a minor militia into an empire within the Nazi state. By 1936, he controlled the Gestapo, the secret police that would become synonymous with terror. By 1939, as Hitler prepared for war, Heinrich Himmler had become one of the most powerful men in Germany. But power for Himmler was not enough. He wanted legacy. He wanted to reshape humanity itself. Deep within his ideology lay a conviction that was uniquely his, more extreme even than Hitler's. The belief that the SS itself could become a new breed of human, a racial elite that would inherit the earth. To achieve this, he established the Lebensborn program, encouraging SS men to breed with women deemed racially pure, creating a new generation of Aryan supermen. At the same time, he was orchestrating the machinery of genocide, the concentration camps, the mobile killing units, the gas chambers. Himmler's fingerprints were on all of it. He was not a distant administrator. He visited the camps. He watched. He understood the precise mechanics of systematic murder better than any man alive. When the war turned against Germany, When the tide of defeat became unavoidable, Himmler's mind turned to new possibilities. If the Nazi state was to be destroyed, then perhaps it could be saved through transcendence. Perhaps there was a technology, a weapon, something beyond conventional understanding that could turn the tide. This obsession led him to embrace every fringe science, every supernatural theory, every pseudo-scientific fantasy that promised power. And this is where Die Glocke enters the story. In the mountains of Lower Silesia, in occupied Poland, in a remote facility known as Der Riese, the Giant, Himmler authorized the construction of an enormous bell-shaped apparatus. The specifics remain unclear, lost to history and the chaos of the war's end. But contemporary accounts suggest it was a massive electromagnetic or gravitational device, perhaps designed to manipulate the fabric of space-time itself, perhaps designed to harness some unknown form of energy. The project consumed vast resources. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners were worked to death constructing the facility. Scientists and engineers were transferred to the project under conditions of absolute secrecy. The work was compartmentalized into such discrete segments that no single person understood the whole picture. What made Die Glocke different from other Nazi weapons programs was that it existed in a realm where science and occultism intersected. Himmler, who had studied astrology and demonology and mysticism, seemed to believe that the bell might offer something beyond military advantage. Some reports suggest that Himmler believed the device could create temporal anomalies, could bend time and space, could perhaps even offer him a pathway to escape the coming catastrophe. Others suggest it was a weapon of unprecedented destructive force, a device that could theoretically affect gravitational fields or produce some kind of directed energy pulse. The truth is that we do not know. What we do know is that Himmler took it seriously enough to protect it at any cost. As 1944 turned to 1945, and Germany's position became increasingly hopeless, the behavior of Himmler became increasingly erratic. He began peace negotiations with the Swedish Red Cross, hoping to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. He attempted to approach the British and Americans, offering them information in exchange for his own survival. At the same time, he continued to pour resources into Die Glocke and other exotic weapons programs, flying discs, advanced rockets, weapons that seemed to exist more in the realm of fantasy than reality. It was as though Himmler had divided his mind into two sections, one that recognized the inevitable defeat of Nazi Germany, and another that clung desperately to the possibility of miraculous salvation. The critical moment came in April 1945. Soviet forces were closing in from the east, less than 100 kilometers away. American forces were advancing from the west. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was collapsing in the span of weeks. Himmler made a decision that would define the final chapter of his life. He ordered Die Glocke evacuated. The massive apparatus, the research, the documentation, all of it was to be transported to safety. Himmler apparently believed that whoever possessed Die Glocke in the aftermath of German defeat would possess unimaginable power. He was thinking beyond the war, beyond the immediate catastrophe, toward a future where Der Glocke might still matter. The evacuation was chaotic. Equipment was loaded onto trains, but the railways were under constant attack from Allied aircraft. Some accounts suggest that a train containing Die Glocke and its associated research was destroyed near the town of Ludwigshafen. Other sources claim that components of the device were loaded onto a U-boat that departed from a German port, heading toward Argentina or possibly Japan. Still, other witnesses reported seeing the bell moved to the Austrian Alps, hidden in an underground facility, protected by SS fanatics who had sworn never to surrender. The truth is that nobody knows. The documents were destroyed or lost. The witnesses either died or remained silent. Die Glocke vanished as completely as if it had never existed. What happened to Himmler himself? offers a window into the psychological reality of the men who had committed the Holocaust. As the Soviet and American forces closed the noose, Himmler went into hiding. He cut off his distinctive features. He shaved his mustache, removed his glasses, and attempted to disappear into the German population. He was captured by British forces near Bremen in May 1945, but the British didn't know who he was. While in captivity, Himmler managed to hide a cyanide capsule in his mouth. After days of interrogation, when the British finally realized his identity, he bit down on the capsule and died, denying the world a proper trial, denying humanity the opportunity to hold him accountable before a court of law. But by then, the mystery of Die Glocke was already consuming the world. In the vacuum of uncertainty, the speculation began. What had the device actually been? Was it a weather control machine? Was it a device designed to manipulate gravity? Had it been tested? Had it actually worked? The silence of the official historical record only intensified the mystery. The Soviet Union collected numerous German scientists and technical personnel after the war, absorbing their knowledge into their own web. By the 1950s, Die Glocke had entered the realm of urban legend. Engineers who had supposedly worked on the project gave interviews hinting at technological impossibilities. The legend grew that the Bell had been successfully evacuated to Argentina, where it supposedly influenced the early development of UFO sightings. Others claimed it had been captured by the Soviets and hidden in the deepest vaults of their most secret research facilities. A few fringe theorists suggested that Die Glocke had actually worked, that it had actually produced some form of temporal distortion or gravitational anomaly, and that remnants of this technology had influenced the course of the Cold War and the space race. The historical reality is almost certainly more mundane, though no less fascinating. Die Glocke was almost certainly an experimental weapons platform, possibly an investigation into exotic propulsion systems or directed energy weapons. Such research was not uncommon during the final stages of the Third Reich. The Nazis had pursued numerous weapons programs that existed at the boundary of plausibility: advanced rockets, jet aircraft, submarine technologies. Many of these programs did produce significant results. The V-2 rocket, for instance, was a genuine technological achievement that would influence spaceflight for decades. Die Glocke was likely similar, an ambitious project that consumed enormous resources but remained fundamentally incomplete by the time of Germany's defeat. What makes Die Glocke historically significant is not that it represented a miraculous technology, but rather that it represents something far more revealing about the Nazi regime itself. Himmler's obsession with Die Glocke, even as the Third Reich was collapsing, illustrates the fundamental detachment from reality that characterized late-stage Nazism. While millions were dying on the battlefields, while the machinery of genocide was still grinding away in the death camps, the leadership of Nazi Germany was pursuing weapons that belonged to the realm of science fiction. This was not pragmatism. This was not rational military strategy. This was the behavior of men who had become untethered from reality, who had invested so much in ideology and mythology that they could no longer distinguish between the possible and the impossible. For Himmler specifically, Die Glocke represented something even more personal. It was the culmination of his worldview, the belief that through technology, through will, through ideology, human beings could transcend their limitations and reshape reality itself. The same mind that had conceived of the Lebensborn program, that had orchestrated the Holocaust, that had imagined an SS superstate ruling over the earth. That same mind saw in Die Glocke the possibility of ultimate power. In a strange way, the Bell was the perfect monument to Heinrich Himmler's ambitions, because it existed primarily as an abstraction, as a possibility, never quite materialized but never quite disproven. After the war, the hunt for Die Glocke consumed far more energy than its actual existence likely warranted. Allied intelligence services dedicated significant resources to tracking down information about the device. German scientists, who had worked in secret weapons programs, were interrogated extensively. Some claimed to have knowledge of Die Glocke. Most could provide only fragmentary information, rumors, and hearsay. The Cold War transformed the search. If the Soviets had captured Die Glocke, then American intelligence needed to know. If the technology was real, then whoever possessed it possessed a devastating advantage. The uncertainty itself became a form of strategic liability. What ultimately became clear to historians is that Die Glocke was almost certainly a real project, but probably not in the fantastical sense that legend suggested. Contemporary Nazi technical journals reference exotic weapons programs, survivor testimonies from concentration camps, mention massive construction projects involving bell-shaped apparatus. But the actual specifications, the actual purpose, the actual functionality of the device, these things likely went with Himmler and the other Nazi scientists to their graves. We know that a project designated Die Glocke existed in the bureaucratic files of the SS. We know that substantial resources were devoted to it. We know that it was considered important enough to evacuate in the final weeks of the war. Beyond that, everything is inference and speculation. The lasting impact of Die Glocke lies not in what it was, but in what it represents. It represents the hubris of ideology. It represents the way that a system built on lies and mythology gradually loses the capacity to distinguish between reality and fantasy. It represents a final, desperate grasp at salvation by a regime that had placed itself beyond the pale of human civilization. More broadly, Die Glocke reminds us that the most dangerous leaders are those who believe their own propaganda, who have surrounded themselves with sycophants, who have constructed a reality so divorced from truth that they can pursue catastrophic policies without understanding their catastrophic nature. Heinrich Himmler lived and died believing in the possibility of Die Glocke. He lived and died believing that the SS would inherit the earth. He lived and died believing in the fantastical mythology of racial science and transcendent technology. But he died in a British detention center, a prisoner, a man utterly defeated. His empire had collapsed. His genocide had been documented. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely a dozen years. And Die Glocke, whatever it might have been, disappeared into the fog of war, never to be definitively recovered, never to save the man or the regime that created it. The bell remains one of history's most intriguing unsolved mysteries, but its significance extends far beyond the question of what it actually was. What truly matters is understanding why men like Himmler would invest such hope in such devices, even as their entire world was crumbling. What matters is recognizing that authoritarian systems, when faced with the reality of their own failure, often retreat further into fantasy and myth rather than confronting truth. What matters is understanding that the most dangerous moments in history are often those when powerful people have become so disconnected from reality that they no longer understand the consequences of their actions. The documents relating to Die Glocke were either destroyed, lost, or deliberately hidden. The scientists who worked on it either died in the war, were captured by Allied or Soviet forces, or disappeared into obscurity. No one alive today can say with absolute certainty what Die Glocke was, or whether it actually worked, or what became of it. But perhaps this uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps Die Glocke's greatest legacy is precisely this mystery, a reminder that history is not always neat and tidy, that there are gaps and silences and unanswered questions, and that these gaps are often where the most important truths hide. What we do know with certainty is this: Heinrich Himmler was one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, a man whose decisions directly led to the deaths of millions. His name is forever connected to the Holocaust, to the machinery of genocide, to the darkest chapter in human history. Die Glocke, whatever it was remained forever overshadowed by this legacy. No exotic weapon, no miraculous technology could redeem the man or justify his actions. In the end, the only bell that rang for Heinrich Himmler was the bell of history, condemning him not to transcendence but to eternal infamy. The story of Die Glocke is ultimately a story about the seductive power of ideology, about how ordinary men can convince themselves to participate in extraordinary evil, and about how even in the face of inevitable defeat, humans cling to myths and fantasies rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. It is a story that demands our attention, not because of what the bell might have been, but because of what its pursuit reveals about the men who sought it. Now we'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Do you believe Die Glocke was a genuine technological breakthrough? Or was it merely the desperate fantasy of a failing regime? Have you encountered other theories about what happened to the bell? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss this fascinating and unsettling chapter of history together.